Dinesh de Souza is one of the most recognized conservative voices in the country. He's a writer and a filmmaker. He was born in India, served as advisor to President Ronald Reagan. And in his latest book, America, he imagines what would happen in the world without the United States. Not without controversy, his book is #2 of the New York Times bestseller list. Dinesh de Souza joins us now from San Diego. Dinesh, it's a pleasure to talk to you again.
Jorge, it's good to be on the show with you.
So what would happen in this planet without America?
America was critical, for example, in winning World War II. If there wasn't an America, it's really hard to see the Allies being able to win that war. Look at the Cold War, which lasted about 40 years, even more, and America won that war. So if the United States wasn't around, the Soviet Union might well be intact, and the world today might be choosing between Islamic radicalism on the one hand, Soviet communism on the other hand. So I'm an immigrant, and as I look at America, it seems to me America has done a whole lot of good for the world, despite the mistakes that we've made.
Dinesh, in the past, you've been very critical of President Barack Obama. However, you might remember that in West Point just recently, President Obama said the United States is and remains the one indispensable nation. So in a way, you and President Barack Obama at least agree on this.
I think my criticism of Obama would be the fact that America, I think, has been losing influence around the world. Look at all these events that are swirling in the Middle East, from Iraq, the problems in Gaza and Israel. Look at what's happening with Putin in the Ukraine. It seems like it used to be in the United States that these things could not happen without the United States having a big say-so, if not controlling the outcome. But now we seem to be almost a helpless observer of events around the world.
Should the United States treat the tens of thousands of children at the border with the same generosity that it has treated you and me?
Well, I think that we have a very generous immigration policy in this country in which we let in 800 to 1 million people every year legally. The tricky thing about what's going on at the border right now is that we hear that these people are refugees, but they're not really refugees. Refugees are people who are fleeing tyranny or people who are fleeing revolution or civil war. There is no civil war going on in South America.
But
most of those governments are democratic.
You don't want to send back children who have been threatened by gangs or who could be killed if they're being deported. I mean, is that your idea? Would you send them back?
It's the journey from Central America to the American border that's probably the most dangerous expedition. We have encouraged that to happen by signaling that we're not serious about enforcing our immigration laws, and we're trying to give amnesty to lawbreakers who are in the country now. I would treat those kids, I would feed them, and then I would reunite them with their families in their own country.
Dinesh, what has happened with the GOP? They block immigration reform in the House, and sometimes they do not understand that they might lose again the White House in 2016 simply because they won't have enough Latino votes. What happened? How do you explain it?
I think this is all very sad because this is a country that's built by immigrants. It's immigrant virtues of deferred gratification, frugality, hard work, enterprise. That's what the immigrants brought to this country. That's what they bring to this country today. It seems to me what we should do now is lock the border and then have a sensible debate about immigration reform in this country.
The problem
is that I think we should lock the border first and then have the debate.
But how can we do that? It would be impossible. 40% of immigrants illegally come by plane. So how do you do that?
We live in an era of technology. I mean, if our government can actually be downloading our contact lists and looking at our phone calls and following our every movement, you don't think that they can track immigrants who are coming across the border? They have the ability to do that. What's missing is the political will. So I think we can be generous and firm at the same time.
What would 2016 look like?
Well, I think that, we'll have had 2 terms of Barack Obama, and the country is in trouble. I mean, look at our economic growth is stagnant. So I think most Americans have a very uneasy feeling about what's been happening in the country under their noses. The government is listening to our phone calls, downloading our email, tracking its own citizens who are not suspected of any crime. So this is a government that's a little out of control. Do the Republicans have a viable alternative? I don't know, but I'm not happy with what's going on in the country now.
Let me go back to your book and to the film. Republican Florida Senator Alan Hayes, he says that he's going to introduce a bill that would make your book a must read in public high schools. But do you think this would make teaching too political?
in some senses, I don't like the idea of must-read anything, but then I remember that in high schools, everything is must-reading, right? This is not college where you choose what courses you take, you decide what books you want to read. In school, they tell you what to read, and so schools have been telling people, you know, here's Al Gore's film on global warming, watch it. So in some senses, I think what the senator is trying to do in Florida is say, listen, the young people are already getting the other side. This book will help them to get a pro-American perspective written by an immigrant. Maybe it'll help them to understand some good things about America.
Dinesh, would you mind if I ask you what your legal situation is right now? You pleaded guilty to finance fraud for aiding a candidate. What's going to happen to you?
I just pleaded guilty to exceeding the campaign finance laws. I gave money to a college friend of mine for 30 years who was running for the Senate in New York. And I go before a judge in September to decide my fate.
Tell me about your books and Costco. What happened?
Well, Costco had decided they made an order to lift all the copies of my book, remove them from Costco. It caused a firestorm of controversy. So Costco did a big U-turn. They rescinded that order. They've put the books back in Costco. They could not have been more apologetic.
Dinesh, many people compare you as the opposite of Michael Moore. In other words, the way you see the world and the way you see this country is exactly the opposite of his. Is that a debate that we're having in this country right now, that we haven't decided exactly what kind of country we want to be?
I mean, to me, it's kind of funny, Jorge, because, you know, here I am. I'm an immigrant. I'm coming to America, and I'm defending American institutions. And then you have a guy like Michael Moore, whose success in life could not have been possible anywhere other than America. And yet, every time he talks about America, you get the sense that he doesn't like it. He's always denouncing the economic system, or he's denouncing the political system. So I'm celebrating America, and he doesn't think America's been a force for good in the world.
Dinesh, thanks so much for talking to us.
My pleasure.
Well, you mentioned Syrian refugees there. This is another thing that you've been tweeting about in the last few days, particularly after the Paris attacks. None of the arbiters of the Paris attacks are Syrian refugees. None of them are refugees at all. 3 of them were born in Paris. 3 of them are from Brussels. Why do you continue to perpetuate this idea that refugees have anything to do with the attacks?
I don't perpetuate the idea. The point I'm making is that ISIS is very active in Syria. ISIS controls Syrian towns. And so...
Absolutely, and that's undisputed. Yeah.
Undisputed, right. And now when you have a large influx of Syrians into Europe and into the United States, if you were ISIS, wouldn't you think that this was a rather easy way to send ISIS guys into Europe and the United States? Wouldn't that be a convenient and natural thought to you if you were trying to figure out how to get, for example, an ISIS sympathizer to Chicago? Wouldn't you say, you know what, all these refugees, they're going anyway, 100,000 of them. Can they possibly vet them all? I mean, you try to vet the guys I went to high school with, try to figure out who their friends are. This is in Mumbai. You wouldn't be able to do it. It's impossible. So this is a wonderful opportunity for ISIS. We should be aware of that, and that simply means we need to do heightened scrutiny. We need to be really careful because we know that the enemy can easily get through our borders this way.
Well, heightened security. So I understand in Europe, for example, they have the Schengen Agreement, which is basically an open border agreement. This is certainly something that both the French authorities, the authorities in Brussels, are going to be looking at a lot closely. They have said so in the last few days as well, since the attacks, that they're going to be looking at intelligence sharing a little bit more. That all makes sense. With regards to the United States and refugees coming into the US, how do you see that there is the same kind of threat that could be in Europe as there is for refugees coming into the United States?
See, I think when I look at the reaction to the Paris attacks, I'm not so much scared by ISIS as I am scared by the rather serene, almost whimsical, almost annoyed and indifferent tone of Obama. Contrast Obama with Hollande. So here's Hollande. He sounds like Churchill, right? These are barbarians. I'm going to be merciless. I'm going to wipe them off the face of the earth. Here's Obama. Well, that was kind of a setback. And now we have another apparently attempted bombing in Germany. I guess another averted setback. Well, these aren't just setbacks. A setback is when Obama says ISIS is contained. I guess very inconveniently the next day, the Paris attacks. So they're not contained. But how can an organization that is controlling towns in Afghanistan and Syria, that is downing a Russian airliner, that is causing havoc in France, how can that be considered a JV team? How can that be considered contained?
Well, the JV comment, I think he's since clarified, and that notion of containment, you know, I'm not going to speak for the president, but he certainly has said that he clarified that he meant that physically they are still within the confines of Syria and Iraq, and they're not setting up mini caliphates in Paris, as an example. But to go back to my question, you didn't answer it. In terms of Syrian refugees coming to the United States, how can you see that they are posing any kind of actual serious threat when there have been no crimes committed by refugees? Germany put out a report that Germany, that has taken over 100,000 refugees, has said that their crime level hasn't increased once since they, not even by 1 percentage point, since they introduced and allowed refugees into their country.
Right, but remember that the whole point of terrorism is to do what hasn't been done before, right? Before 9/11, planes were never used to go into buildings. So if you had said, listen, what's wrong with giving Islamic radicals flight lessons because they've never flown planes into buildings? Yes, but that's because that's the new idea that occurred to them. So I'm simply saying now, something that we would previously be naive about, refugees, they're running away from persecution, we ought to take them in with open arms. And all I'm saying is now we realize, wait a minute, these refugees can be used as a way to smuggle bad guys into the United States.
That to me sounds a bit like Minority Report politicking, though.
Well, I think to me it sounds exactly like reading common sense into the headlines. So, again...
But the common sense, I think, is taking a huge leap from facts that are just not there, and then using these immaterial, non-existent facts to then craft policy.
Let me ask you this.
Which doesn't sound intelligent to me.
If someone said to you, here are the resources to cover the expense, would you take a dozen of these refugees into your house, knowing as little as we do about them, and would you feel safe?
But we do know a lot about them, because the process to actually be a refugee in the United States can take anywhere from 12 to 18 months, the way that they're scrutinized. I mean, you said to yourself, you're an immigrant, I'm an immigrant, I have an accent, I'm here on a visa. The process for me to get any kind of visa is ridiculously inordinate, and I'm somebody who has, you know, presence online, in
but
newspapers, all about it. No, I know, but
you're saying about
how can you verify that this person, 12 people, if 12 Syrians were to come into your house, how do you know that they're not anything dubious or criminal? Because the investigation and the background check that the Department of Homeland Security currently requires is around 18 months long.
But the refugee process tends to circumvent those things. We're talking about taking 100,000 people in a relatively short time. When you're talking about...
No one's taking 100,000. The president had mentioned 10,000.
Well, no, 10,000 maybe immediately, but the numbers that have been talked about are much, much larger than that. Europe is taking a lot, and we're taking a lot. Look, the French are now saying we need to reassess the process. We just need to look at it harder. I'm very pro-immigrant. I'm an immigrant, and my politics...
Are you pro-immigrant?
Of course I am. My politics come out of that. This country was built by immigrants, and to me, the great power of conservatism, the reason I call myself a conservative, is I want a ladder of opportunity that I can climb up.
What do you think of the way that some of the 2016 candidates have been talking about immigrants? The front-runners, Ben Carson, Donald Trump, have been making some very disparaging remarks about immigrants. Do you think that they're the wrong people to be leading the charge for the Republicans for 2016?
Well, first of all, I do think the Republican Party should not and cannot be the party against immigration. No. But I do think that there is a legitimate frustration with illegal immigration. No country can be a real country while having, in a sense, a completely porous border. If you go down to the border, as I did last year, you basically see fences that keep stopping, fences with huge holes in them so that you can actually drive a car through them. So this is a fraud. This is an attempt to say to the American people, we have a fence, but look, you can come right through right here. And there's no one to stop you if you do. So
I don't believe that that's true. I don't believe that. I mean, I've been down to Tijuana as well, and I think that if I try and get through the line with my passport, I'm going to be stopped by the police.
No, don't be silly. We're not talking about going through the line. There's a little border post here, and then there are miles and miles of fence, and all I'm telling you is if you simply follow those fences, you will see the fence stops, and it literally becomes open country. You can just walk across the border.
I think there's a big difference between border security, which I think people on both sides agree is necessary. I mean, you know, we are a sovereign country, and of course there needs to be border security. And we have laws, absolutely. But there is a big difference between that and then talking about whole people, as Donald Trump did, as rapists, as an example. Do you think that the frontrunners, Donald Trump and Ben Carson, are getting it wrong when it comes to immigration?
Well, I think that, as I say, I think that they are reflecting a deep frustration about the fact that the United States, the federal government, the states are doing better, but the federal government refuses ultimately to maintain borders. Now, as someone who went through the legal process, as I assume you did, it took us a lot of time, and it also cost us a fair bit of money, and we had to play by the rules, and we had to stand in line, and we did. So why would we condone, as immigrants, a process that allows other guys, just as in the same way as you're standing in the Starbucks line, some guy walks to the front, pushes everybody aside, orders a Starbucks, everyone in line is going to tell him to get out of the line, get in line.